Hello, welcome back to the plastic tracks of the World Ocean Summit. I'm Jan Piotrowski, I'm the Economist business editor, and welcome to this discussion on the plastics is focusing on the consumer goods sector the best ways to minimize plastic use. And to discuss this subject with me, I am joined by four excellent and incredibly experienced panelists. We have Tracy, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer of Colgate-Palmolive, Ignacio Gavilan, who is the Director of Environmental Sustainability for the Consumer Goods Forum, Simon Hombersley, who is the Chief Executive of Zampla, and Simon Reddy, who's the Director at the Pew Charitable Trusts. And you'll find the full biographies of our panelists on the screen underneath this media player. Right, so to begin with, I would like to get a sense of just how big a part of the ocean plastic problem is the consumer goods industry. Because obviously, the consumer goods companies are not the only users of plastic in the world. There are plenty of others. But Ignacio, do we have a sense of how big a responsibility your industry carries for this problem?
Well, thank you. It's a very difficult number to estimate, but I can tell you one thing is the most visible plastic that you will find in your ocean, in your environment in general. So it's a figure that we are trying to get. We're working with different stakeholders, but I cannot give you an exact number as of today.
Can you give us a very brief sense of how you go about trying to estimate it?
Well, it's we're working with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, by the way, to understand this figure. So it'll be. I think we need to go back to the companies and understand the volumes that are purchased, how it gets transformed, and how much gets in the marketplace to really estimate. Out of that, we know 8 million tons get to the ocean, unfortunately, every day, but we don't know what percentage comes from electronics, consumer goods, food, beverage, beauty, hygiene. Those are the numbers we still need to really get our heads around.
Simon R, can you comment on that? I mean, you're obviously looking at it from a slightly different vantage point to Ignacio.
Yes, the Pew Charitable Trusts working with Systemic, our report, Breaking the Plastic Wave, showed that currently roughly about 11 million tons of plastic is going into the ocean a year, and this is set to increase to 29 million tons per year by 2040, which is actually potentially, that is actually the volume of plastic in the ocean growing by 450 million tons over the next 20 years. This is a business as usual scenario. It's probably worth mentioning that current commitments by industry and by governments only currently will make 7% reduction to that. And so obviously the level of ambition needs to significantly increase. One of the problems we do have is that it's very difficult for companies to work out how much plastic their actual footprint is. A lot of companies do not know. They know how much plastic they maybe buy in for their products, but they don't know how much plastic their total plastic footprint is. And so some sort of disclosure and reporting mechanism is an area we're particularly interested in, similar to what you see on carbon and on wood and on water. Some sort of disclosure and reporting mechanism would help us understand better the size of the problem. As they say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I think it's really important for industry and governments to understand how big the problem is in order to effectively apply some solutions.
That's actually interesting. You just sort of provoked me a little bit in that manage and measure correlation that is obviously much cited in all manner of industries with respect to all manner of processes. But in a way, if you think about it, the problem is evident, and it's a sort of it could almost be used as a cop-out by the industry to say, well, measuring it is really, really hard, so you can't really expect us to manage it. Is that something that you've encountered in your conversations with the industry?
I don't think measurement is hard. I mean, we're seeing this now on a number of industries. Look at carbon, for instance. The Carbon Disclosure Project. We're seeing thousands of companies now on a regular basis measuring and disclosing their carbon usage. And this is an important metric, I think, for companies to understand. It helps them understand what their baselines are. And then from those baselines, efforts can be made to reduce carbon in the same way efforts could be made to reduce plastic consumption. You need to understand what your baseline is. And also it provides a certain accountability. I think it's fantastic that companies are committing to reduce plastic usage, but plastic usage relative to what? We need to establish what baselines are, and so we can measure progress going forward. And all of these things are important. It's also worth adding that they're important, I think, for financial markets as well. More and more investors are concerned about the environmental performance of their companies that they invest in. And I think it's important that these measurements are shown alongside a company's performance, so investors can make decisions as to whether they want to invest or not. We're seeing that BlackRock has just come out and said that they will only involve themselves in companies that are actively reducing their carbon footprint. And we're seeing more and more of this from investors. And so these measurements are crucially important.
Anne, I would like to ask you now, from the perspective of a specific consumer goods company, Colgate-Palmolive, how do you think about these baselines, and how do you think about trying to get a handle on your plastic footprint?
Well, let me start by saying we've been talking about what gets measured gets managed. We like to say at Colgate, what gets measured gets done. So measurement, I would agree, is extremely important. And I think baselines are key, but what's really important in this case is standardization, so that we're all measuring in a standard, harmonized way. And Ignacio mentioned the importance of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So we are part of the global commitment. And what I think is important about the work they're doing is they are being viewed as kind of the global thought leaders in terms of establishing these standards. So we, as part of the global commitment, we have to disclose and report, or we willingly disclose and report the amount of plastic that we produce and sell every year. But getting a handle on what then results in waste to the environment is a tougher problem, I would say.
How do you even start going about that? The sort of how do you estimate? What leakage you as a specific company are responsible for?
Yeah, and so that's what we would call our plastic waste footprint, and that is something we are very interested in understanding. But Colgate, along with our peer companies, are looking at the methodologies to understand how best to do that. So I guess one thing I can share with you is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is partnering with WWF to develop a tool that will help companies to do this. And we have signed on to be one of the early adopters of this tool. It's called the Resource Tool. So it goes beyond just understanding our footprint, the focus on the fate of the plastic based on data that they've gathered globally. So you can imagine that fate would vary depending on the maturity or the infrastructure wherever you are in the world, whether it's Europe, which is probably the most advanced in terms of infrastructure and discipline by consumers, versus other parts of the world where it's less so.
So one way to solve this problem is obviously to reduce the use of plastic, or to reduce the leakage of the plastic into the environment. But Simon H., another way is to come up with alternative materials that do not have such a heavy environmental footprint. So could you tell us what Zampla does?
Sure. So Zampla is a University of Cambridge spin-out, and we're making a next-generation replacement for plastics from plant protein. And I completely share the view of Simon, other Simon, about the sort of Breaking Plastic Wave report has done a lot of work to define the scale of this. But I think what we're looking at here is today's problem. And one of the things that we're looking at is the world in 2040. And that's not that far away when you're talking about a problem of the scale of plastic. So I think we have to be thinking about what genuine replacements for plastic look like and what the world looks like when we're growing our own materials, because there's a whole bunch of other issues there. But to pick up on Anne's point, the standards actually apply to those replacement materials as well as today's materials. There's an awful lot of false claim going on out there about the replacements. So we need leadership and thought leadership across the board here, not just in solving today's problems, but actually setting the framework for a genuinely sustainable future where we have plastic that doesn't pollute.
So, but do tell me what Zampla actually does and what sort of product, and how it differs and what happens to it when you discard it. Just to give us a little bit of a sense of the innovation here.
Sure. Well, most of the plastic replacements we see out there at the moment are made from plant polysaccharides, and they are chemically cross-linked, so they're not completely natural materials. So they're an improvement on fossil fuels, but they actually have end-of-life issues. We have a material which is made from plant protein, so a completely new class of material, which we engineer into novel structures that perform like plastics, but at the end of life, they're actually edible. Our first product is actually an edible material. It's been certified as a food. So when it hits the ocean or it hits the soil, it's eaten by microbes and returned to protein. So there are a few other materials like us in this class of genuinely next generation material. But that's where we're at. We're making.
I'm sort of hoping that you say that it can be consumed by humans. So we have we have the packaging that we can just fill up on if whatever is inside the package.
But I think the best form of packaging is no packaging, and as Colgate-Palmolive is already doing, looking at format change and all sorts of interesting things about how we actually solve this problem by engineering it out rather than simply seeking to substitute and replace. So there are no simple solutions to this. It's an enormously complicated problem with a lot of things going on, and all of us have a part to play in it. But I think that the brands are really the leaders here because they have the ability and the power to make real change, and they are being driven by and leading their consumers. So I think the brands are critical here, but all of us have a part to play.
So, Anne, what would it take for Colgate-Palmolive to use a lot of Simon H's product instead of the stuff that you're using now? What are the sort of obstacles to rapid scale up and adoption?
Where do I start? First of all, it's really exciting. So I'd love to learn more. And we do have, a holistic strategy around how to tackle this issue. And one of them is around design and specifically new material. So we're very interested, and I would love to follow up with Simon afterwards to learn more about what his company is doing. But I guess the number one thing is that, let's take toothpaste. We would have to do the work to understand if toothpaste would maintain its quality and efficacy in a new type of packaging material. We always do that when we come up with a new design. So that's first and foremost. And then what would be any kind of changes or adaptation to the consumer use or experience in this new material? One of the big barriers that we're finding is that consumers are creatures of habit and actually don't like to change very easily. So one of the big areas of research that we're undertaking is how to change consumers' behaviors, I guess through making it a better experience to use products in a different way. Like an example, the other thing we're looking at is how to deliver our benefits in a whole new way. So take toothpaste again. Could you deliver it in a chewable format? And then it might be more adaptable to Simon's packaging material. But we have to make sure consumers are willing to change to brushing their teeth in a new and different way. So those are some of the barriers. And note that I didn't say cost. Cost is always a barrier.
I was going to ask about that. I was expecting you to say cost is number one.
And we recognize that moving packaging to a truly circular economy, there's a cost and a scale element to it. But if you don't start somewhere. We've just launched the recyclable tube. We're in the process of converting every single tube that we put out there to this new format. We put out close to 9 billion tubes a year, and it costs more. But we have a commitment to get back to cost neutral over time. We're not passing that on to the consumer, but we recognize as a world's leaders in oral care that someone has to go first, so we're going first. So cost is a consideration. It certainly has to be taken into account, but it's not like in the past the leading indicator that we would start with.
So Ignacio, so branding and brands and the importance of brands was mentioned a couple of times. How easy is it to actually make consumers more aware of this problem and care more, and actually, have their sort of revealed preferences through their consumption habits reflect something that a lot of them say in the abstract? In the abstract, a lot of people care a lot about the environment, but when when push comes to shove, a lot of them don't actually do all that much to alter their behavior. So how can consumer brands educate to be more responsible?
Yes, could I build on the last point on 2040, if I may, and then I go into the consumer's question?
Sure, go ahead.
Because I was thinking on the 2040 scenario that Simon H. was painting, and will FMCG majors will no longer be buying fossil fuel materials. So I think there is unlikely that there will be a one-size-fits-all alternative to our current mindset, which is mostly around digging, using, and disposing. It's very linear. So I think we need a portfolio of viable solutions that we can draw on from different use cases. So, for example, if you look at reduce, so less material required if we extend the life of materials and shift to new business models, such as sharing or reuse. And we've seen many examples with the Ubers, the Netflix, the cooling as a service in the retail industry. Substitute, for example. So recycled materials taking the place of virgin materials. Drop in bio-based materials that perform pretty much the same as fossil-based materials, but with a much lower carbon footprint. And this might not solve the challenge of end of life for many materials, but I think is worth considering, because compostable bio-based materials, particularly, they can also increase the recovery of food waste and can be safely returned to organic system. But I just wanted to make a quick reflection on this one, because I think it's important. 2040 is not that far away. And moving away from fossil-based plastics is a major shift for us as not only industry, but consumers as well, which links to your question on consumers. Despite our name, Consumer Goods Forum, we don't have that much intelligence around the consumers. We don't commission too many studies, but we do talk to a lot of members, of course, and there's a collective sort of intelligence gathered. COVID, for example, has not helped on plastics. We have another initiative on food waste, and we've seen that consumers now want more plastic protecting their products. So when we were moving out of plastic in some fruits and vegetables, COVID arrives, more plastics, because some retailers have experienced the fact that those goods that are not packaged, they don't sell well, for a perception of everybody touching, etc. Consumers definitely want change. They put a lot of pressure on us as brands to reduce. So what we did, what we think is the recipe for this change, and what we can do from our perspective is less and better plastic, and then a better system. Because at the end of the day, obviously that plastic ends up in the ocean, not because the brands are throwing it into the ocean. It's a system that doesn't work. It's a system that is in itself inefficient of collection, sorting, and recycling. So we need to get that system into the closed loop that we all want.
So Simon R., do you have a sense of what brands could do to try and ensure that consumers do take this seriously and actually follow on their vague notions of wanting to help the planet?
Yeah, I mean, brands are in a unique position. They're influencers, and they're influenced by their market as well. And I think that's a phenomenal position to actually solicit change and actually look for advantages and opportunities to take this forward. At the end of the day, the product that many of the consumer goods companies are selling, it's not the plastic; it's what's in the plastic. It's the plastic is simply the container. And so, there lies the opportunity to show leadership, to show, brand advantage, I think, from developing new ideas. Picking up on what Simon H. mentioned earlier as well is the whole issue of innovation I find particularly fascinating. And there does seem to be a sort of innovation gap, and linking that into the whole COVID debate as well. We saw with COVID that vaccines that normally take 2 to 3 years to come to market are actually coming to market in 9 months or 6 to 9 months, which is an incredible feat of achievement that I think that collectively we've managed to do. We have, I think, similar problems in relation to plastics. If you think of plastics development or alternatives to plastics, if you think of them on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the sort of idea in the laboratory and 10 being a product on the shelf, there seems to be funding up to sort of level 4, which is when the product leaves the laboratory. But it then doesn't seem to get any money until level 7, which is when it's a viable product that can be invested in. And I think, there should be lessons learned from how you increase innovation and you drive innovation through the innovation chain. And there are lessons from COVID there, I think, that could be applied to how we look at some of these other problems that we're dealing with. For instance, how do we overcome what they call the innovation valley of death when it comes to new substances? How do we get from level 4, which is a laboratory, to level 7, where it's a product that could actually be invested in and potentially used by consumer goods companies to contain their products? And I think, these are the things that we should be thinking about.
So I think your comparison with COVID and with the incredible speed at which the vaccines have been developed is actually quite instructive, because it doubtless happened, but what it took to happen was that basically, the vast majority of the world's 7.5 billion people had to be directly affected by it. Because if you don't, climate change has been droned on about for 3 decades by scientists, and for 10 years at least by sort of the population and activists at large, and yet not all that much. I mean, something is happening, obviously, but nowhere near enough, because it seems that it's just not affecting all that many people in a way that they see as direct. So I think, I absolutely agree that there is scope for great innovation, but it feels like you have to make this pertinent and relevant to individuals, which COVID did by its nature of being a pandemic, and many other problems, collective action problems, simply do not, because they do not affect everyone. I wanted to ask Simon H., on that scale of 1 to 10, where is Zampla? Is it in that valley of death? Has it emerged beyond number 7? And if so, how did you pull it off?
Well, we've just closed a £6 million funding round, so we're okay for a bit. But Simon is right, there is a valley of death in all of this. I think what is incredibly positive about the plastics issue is level both of consumer engagement, but also brand engagement in this. And as Simon R. said, there's a sort of leadership and also following role that brands have. They're kind of like members of parliament. They have to show some leadership to their constituents, but they also actually have to follow them in some way. So the brands are actually beginning to do things ahead of regulation. They're actually making changes here to get ahead of their consumers, because in 2040, those children today will be the main purchasers in the family budget. So they're already responding to these consumer drivers. So I think there are positive things there, but from a sort of basic commercial point of view, my job is to focus on the problems that only we can solve and that are immediate. And in fact, it's not particularly around this sort of plastics that Ignacio was talking about that can be captured within systems, which is a very good focus for everybody to have. But if you go to the beaches of Indonesia, there are plastics there that are not captured within systems. And it's single-use sachets, it's microplastics, it's a whole bunch of applications there which are not being captured within systems change, where there is a very, very emotional and real reason for addressing. So that's where we're planning to get through the funding challenge to get into mass scale. And mass scale is important. You do not solve big problems with small companies. So we have to cross that bridge, and we have to get to the point where Anne in 2040 can place an order for not a few tons of material, but hundreds of tons of material. And we need to think about the water use, the land use, and the local equality issues that might involve in terms of land use and so forth. So there are some quite big, wider sustainability questions to ask as we transition away from fossil fuels.
And I want to come back to you and ask you about sort of consumer appetite for these sort of novel solutions. Do you have a sense that, obviously not all consumers are equal, and consumers in the West, in the developed world, are going to have very different priorities to consumers in the developing world. But do you already sense that there are large groups of consumers, sort of materially large groups of consumers, who are willing to make that conscious consumer decision, even sometimes if it means, for instance, paying a small premium? Or is that still a niche pursuit? And I'm especially interested in what you're seeing in the developing world, where obviously you also have very large markets, and whether the attitudes there are changing, because obviously in places like India and Indonesia and China, people have other possibly more burning concerns than caring about what happens to their plastic waste. So I'm sort of, it's quite a broad question, but I was sort of wondering if you're already seeing some movement on the consumer behavior front in various parts of the world.
Yes, I think it's growing. I think it depends how kind of radical the innovation is. Like I said, we are going to be converting our entire toothpaste line to this new tube, which actually has a different look and feel to our existing aluminum line tube. It's a bit different. I think to your point, there's definitely an awareness level. I think a lot more research needs to be done to understand, around what consumers are willing to accept, what they're willing to pay. There's lots of studies out there that say consumers will pay more for sustainable packaging, and others say they won't. But the awareness, to Ignacio's point, it's a very, very visible issue. The plastic, if we want to stick to the plastic issue, it's very visible. People are very aware. I think they want to do the right thing, so they want to change. So it's definitely, the appetite is there on the side of the consumers. I do think it varies between developed and developing parts of the world. But companies like us are going to implement our changes globally. We're not going to discern between developed and developing, just as we are with the tube. I think this whole notion of scale is important, an important one that Simon H. just raised. We have to get there quickly. I mean, the scale is what's going to drive it. That's one reason we're, by the way, sharing the technology for our tube, because we don't want to compete on the packaging itself. We want to make sure we deliver the benefit of the toothpaste, but we want all tubes to convert to a recyclable tube as quick as possible. So innovation is key, scale is key, speed is key. I think that the last point I'll make that I think is really exciting is, and this is something that we've enjoyed through partnership with the Consumer Goods Forum, is the level of pre-competitive cooperation and collaboration that's ongoing now with these big brand companies to get there, because again, no one company can do this alone. And we welcome the accelerators, the innovators, the entrepreneurs out there with new ideas, but the bigger companies can work together to bring that to scale as quickly as possible.
So Simon R., you used to work for C40, the group of climate conscious cities, and I'm sort of wondering, how far up the priority list do you think the plastic problem is for companies or for local authorities in various places? I mean, there are increasing pressures at the moment on companies, especially from various stakeholders, and suddenly companies have to care about everything. They have to care about climate, reducing their carbon footprints. They have to care about reducing their plastic footprints. At the same time, they have to care about equity in employment. They have to care about their suppliers. Sort of, this is a lot of pressures, all of them warranted. How do you think plastic sort of features its calculations? Because obviously companies have only a limited bandwidth, they have limited resources to deal with various problems, and that is obviously true for consumer goods companies as it is for anybody else. And how big a deal is it, do you think, in the industry, which is also facing all these other pressures?
I mean, I can't speak for the industries. I can certainly speak, from my experience of working at C40 cities and different sort of, cities around the world. I actually went to Jakarta many times with the C40, and there is real problems there with plastic waste. I mean, it's clogging up the streams, it's clogging up the rivers. All the surrounding mangrove areas are full of plastic waste as well. It's a massive tourism issue because, of course, tourism is a major source of income to some of these countries. I mean, this is why Indonesia actually is really kind of leading the way on the issue of plastic pollution, because tourism is a major draw for Indonesia, and tourists don't want to go on holiday and find that the ocean is full of plastic. And when we look at the plastic problem, and we're looking at 3 times more plastic going into the ocean per year by 2040. It doesn't go away quickly. It doesn't biodegrade. It keeps floating around. It keeps bobbing up. I mean, I'm in my 50s, and I certainly remember a time when I went to beaches and there was very little plastic on it, even in the UK. And I go to beaches now and there's an awful lot of plastic. Imagine where we're going to be 20 years from now. Earlier you mentioned that people are slow to react to climate change. Climate change has been slow to impact many people. I think people now are starting to see the impacts more and more and are starting to react. I see plastic as much more reactionary because, people go to supermarkets, they buy these products, they then go on walks and they go to the beach and they see similar products on the beaches. And this is only going to get worse and worse and worse. And I do think that is impacting people, not just in the developed world, but also in the developing world. It's about quality of life. It's about, the space that you go to, and it's about sort of understanding the environment that you're in. And if that environment is increasingly clogged with plastic waste, then people do react to that.
So, Ignacio, I wanted to follow up on that with you as a sort of representative of industry broadly construed. And do you have a sense that this is an issue which preoccupies the industry over and above these other competing pressures on CEOs' attention? And in particular, I wonder whether you think that there might be a trade-off between dealing with the plastic problem, which is visible, but sort of not existential in the same way as climate change is. Because it seems that that there are companies like everybody else have limited resources, and dealing with one problem necessarily means that you're sort of sacrificing dealing with another problem to an extent. So is the industry sort of dealing with the plastic problem at the expense of dealing with these other problems, which may be less visible less tangible, but no less important?
I think definitely the issue of plastics has been prioritized over the past 2-3 years. I can tell you from the Consumer Goods Forum perspective, we deal with many issues. This one has been prioritized over the past 2 years at least. And maybe one of the reasons is because it's more objective. Companies are in control of the packaging, or somehow they're in control, compared to deforestation, where they're removed 17 layers from what happens on the forest, compared to some of the other issues. One thing that we've seen over the past few years is that obviously there are many initiatives sprouting around the globe, fueled by concerns for the environment, and in particular the oceans. And I think the message in here is collaboration. I think Anne mentioned it. The industry has realized that no matter how big you are, you will never get these problems sorted on your own. So collaboration is the key to reduce and eliminate the impacts of plastic waste. A few areas where collaboration, especially among consumer goods companies, could help drive progress include Simon H. developing innovative solutions for strategic materials that today pose a challenge at end of life. So films, laminates, some specific types of plastics. Partnerships, super important, ideally with the waste management sector to advance the system that I mentioned, the system that we need to fix. Collection, sorting, recycling technologies that will enable a much greater recovery of value from existing waste streams. So things like, for example, sorting technologies that have greater ability to separate recyclable materials. And to go back to our original point of measuring, that will be fantastic, because then we can sort materials. And then I think the third element will be developing and growing a very strong end market for all the recovered material. So making sure that we are creating this circularity.
Well, I think that unfortunately we've basically ran out of time. But I would like to sort of end on a positive note, and that is that it seems finally that the industry does, maybe doesn't know exactly how much responsibility it bears, but it feels that it bears some responsibility. And I think that is a critical, very, very important starting point. Perhaps that's being, not quite generous enough. We're well beyond starting point, as with innovations such as Zampla's, with the sort of projects that Colgate-Palmolive is pursuing. So I think we're well beyond the starting point, but it does seem that the feeling that there is some responsibility on the part of the industry is an incredibly important and encouraging sign. So with that, I would like to thank all the panelists for a tremendous discussion, and I would like to ask all the delegates to stay tuned for the plenary sessions, which are going to be taking place for the rest of the day. And obviously, please join us for more sessions in the plastic track on Friday. Also, if you would like to visit ocean.economist.com, which is a new website for the World Ocean Initiative, and it features news and articles about the sustainable blue economy. Panelists, thank you very much for a great discussion, and hopefully we can reconvene at in a couple of years to find out how much more progress we have all made. Thank you very much.